On the 31st of October 1517, a German priest nailed 95 statements against papal indulgences on the door of a church at Wittenberg, Germany. His name was Martin Luther, a priest, a heretic, an outlaw, and a thinker. His rebellious act would spiral into the Reformation and the formation of Protestant thought, which rivaled against the then dominant Catholic Church in the Latin West. The 16th to 18th centuries would see the brutal wars of religion and the mass persecution of Catholics and Protestants alike. This turmoil would shape Europe forever. Luther himself wrote many great works of philosophy and is responsible for the growth of Lutheranism. German nationalists, in particular, credit Luther as one of the finest minds produced from the Rhine to the Baltic Sea, all down to the Alps. But let's take a step back and consider what kind of historians would study Luther's move on the day before All Saints' Day. Religious historians, obviously, but also perhaps social and political historians, as well as the many scholars of war. Yet another category lingers in my mind: intellectual history. Luther did more than shape the political and social climate of Europe. He also incorporated philosophy and theology among the lands. Luther had changed the world in both a theoretical and real sense. Welcome to this video on intellectual history. Here I'll explain what it is and the many approaches intellectual historians can take. I'm Madeline Rose Jones and I study history, literature and culture. Welcome to Snowy Fictions. Part 1. The history of ideas. Intellectual history refers to the study of intellectuals, ideas and thought patterns over time, as per the definition given by Peter E. Gordon from Harvard University. One historian may find himself fascinated by the development and consequences of neoliberal ideology, whereas another may also incorporate rival ideas such as traditional conservatism, Marxism, and the thought produced by notable parties such as the CCP, Alternative for Germany, and the current stage of the Republican Party in the United States. We ought to imagine ideas as a large bowl of spaghetti, where strands of pasta touch and blend with one another, creating never-ending connections and hidden destinations, for intellectual history has no beginning nor end. We, as men and women of the 21st century, have inherited the ideas of the past, and we will develop those thoughts further, for better or for evil. It's no surprise for intellectual historians to take fascination with dialogues between multiple timeframes and among competing schools of philosophy. Like Socrates defending himself, intellectuals throughout the ages have found themselves in the same position, hence the fascination from intellectual historians. Other concerns regard mythology, political propaganda, debating others, and the history of the book. Interestingly, and much to the credit of intellectual historians, there is a deep fascination with how ideas are received across multiple populations. Such is the case for the history of Christianity, as there are profound differences across the many Christianities around the world. So often, an intellectual historian may stumble across an idea and, like a Russian nesting doll, and find the relics of previous philosophies and radical thinkers. One good example of intellectual history is The Cheese and the Worms by microhistorian Galo Ginsberg, which is also surrounding social histories. Some works of history, such as Edward Gibbon's Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, can contribute to intellectual history, even if that's not the main focus. Gibbons provides commentary on Roman religion, Christianity, and Enlightenment-era ideals regarding liberty and rationalism. The intellectual historian, so often, is never immune from having his own ideas and perceptions about his world, although most do aim for some form of objectivity. Part 2. Difference with philosophy. Intellectual history sounds quite similar to another humanities field, philosophy, which is described by the University of St. Andrews as the study of a variety of fundamental questions about the nature of ourselves and the world we live in. On first glance, philosophy is born out of theory and speculation, whereas intellectual history is more grounded in reality, as well as the human past. I broadly agree. As a woman trained in historical methods, philosophy is quite frustrating in how abstract it can get, especially when grand statements are made about certain topics like religion or art. But then I remind myself of the value in the academic study of philosophy because it's through these abstract concepts and ideas that we can better understand history. A philosopher may interpret St. Thomas Aquinas' commentary on just war theory as part of an eternal discussion about warfare and ethics, in sync with ancient and contemporary thinkers. An intellectual historian, however, may view Summa Theologia as a source of the High Middle Ages, a scholastic period of learning and Catholicism, with ongoing crusades and concerns about declining power. Philosophers and intellectual historians aren't necessarily polar opposites, and there certainly is overlap. Of course, philosophers care about history, and intellectual historians have a willingness to get quite theoretical, but there's a difference in methodology and methods. Both intellectual history and philosophy share similarities, and the biggest one concerns rigor. It is crucial for philosophers and intellectual historians to present arguments rich in clarity and are alert to the work of others. There are also many opportunities to work with scholars from art history, theology, and music, to name a few. So, whilst intellectual history and philosophy may seem to have very specific definitions, there is certainly a lot of possibility and potential. Part 3. Intersectioning fields. Intellectual history intersects with every category of historical study. One can primarily become a social historian, yet still have to encounter and respond to intellectual history. Historians today have to juggle different strands of time, place, and theme, even if they specialize in a certain topic. No contemporary historian can truly understand intellectual history isolated from other fields like cultural history, for ideas are formed throughout time and in response to events and personalities. An intellectual historian, therefore, cannot merely study ideas, but must understand their appeal or decline in certain periods and places. Note, however, these ideas and those who produce them may not necessarily be philosophers. Whilst philosophy has a special role in intellectual history, we should not limit the field to certain schools or qualifications required in human history to shape the study of the intellectual past. An intellectual historian, therefore, will take interest in anyone, really, who produces and influences the philosophical climate in a given place. Yet, they are also intrigued by how ideas shape history. Being historians, there is also an interest in the reception of antiquity and the Middle Ages. I discussed this in my video concerning medievalism. Reception or reception studies are fascinated by the legacy and impact of previous civilizations and cultures in a given time period. We can observe the reception of antiquity in the Christian writer Boethius from the 6th century AD, who incorporated aspects of Roman religion and philosophy into his thinking. His concept of the Wheel of Fortune mirrors that of Fortuna, a goddess of fortune and the personification of luck in the pre-Constantine Roman Empire. This is just one example of many. Intellectual historians, therefore, must resist viewing their given period as a silo in time, isolated from everything else. The study of history is driven by cause and effect, interconnectivity, different strands coming together, then being ripped apart. Of course, certain strands of history lend themselves very well to the history of ideas. Broadly speaking, these include religious history, the history of science, technology and medicine, art history, economic thought, and of course, political history. An intellectual historian will do more than muse about philosophy or reading treatises. It's not so uncommon for intellectual historians to incorporate methods involving archives, statistics, oral history, and paleography. Typically, an intellectual historian has an undergraduate training in historical research and primary sources, which helps contextualize his or her research in the wider history-based landscape. Part 4. Sources. Being a subtype of history, intellectual historians use both primary and secondary sources, as well as academic literature. These sources, therefore, can take multiple forms and may include manifestos, religious pamphlets, speeches, magazine articles, art exhibitions, and instructions. Remember, an intellectual historian isn't just interested in the ideas themselves, but how they are expressed, communicated, and molded over time. Take Marxism. The Communist Manifesto was first published in 1848, a notorious year for revolution in Europe. Decades later, and a few years following the Russian Civil War, the Soviet Union was formed with a guiding ideology being Marxism-Leninism and atheism being the preferred religion. An intellectual historian must understand this development and consider the changes and perceptions that Marxism underwent until reaching the Bolsheviks. Intellectual historians, therefore, must have an excellent grasp on chronology and the many ways ideas change over time alongside societies, nations, and religions. The sources used are also dependent on the studied time period. An intellectual historian of, say, early modern France will certainly need to know English, Latin, French, and maybe German to read primary sources, which may include treatises, literature, and legal declarations. This, as you can see, differs to the primary sources and languages of 20th century America, where I imagine you would engage more with audio-visual material like a speech recording or a famous photograph. This variety certainly makes intellectual history a remarkable field in understanding philosophy and the past. Conclusion. Intellectual history is an exciting part of the study of history, but it is a wide field. This video was a mere introduction, and there is certainly more to discuss. But back to you. Who are your favourite philosophers, and what eras of history fascinate you? Comment below. I'd love to read your thoughts, and if you'd like, subscribe for frequent videos about history, literature, and culture. I also have Skillshare classes on creative writing and a mailing list, linked below. Thanks for watching, and I will see you soon.